So, quick recap is that your spirit is actually your higher self. And that is the part of you that's immortal. That is what we are working towards and what we're ascending to align with. And the development of the false ego and personality is what contributes to all the imbalances, all the blockages, all the distortions, right? That keep us out of alignment with our higher self. Your soul is essentially your soul is essentially connected to your astral emotional body, okay, which creates also the false ego based on the programming that we talked about, collective and the personal unconscious mind, and also as well as your own unique individual experiences, right? And because of that, your soul is mortal, right? Your soul is mortal. And what I mean by that is that your spirit is the eternal part of you that is incarnating over and over again and is never dies and is completely immortal. Your soul is a tool and body for this lifetime. And each time there is a new soul that incarnates, it goes through certain stages, right? And there's 7 specific unique stages it goes through as part of its incarnated journey. The first stage is birth, okay? And it is at this point of the soul's journey that the consciousness of the baby still feels itself to be attached to the mother as a sense of oneness within the womb, right? So still within the womb, and we still feel this oneness. We're still connected to not only her, but also divine source. It's very much a reflection of that same oneness felt as part of the higher self. So this is where this journey begins. Even after birth, the umbilical cord, when the umbilical cord is cut, a small thread of awareness is still maintained to divine source. The pure, unconditional love of divine source is still trickling through on an energetic level, right? That connects and threads the baby to the unconscious mind. So there's still that connection there. The projection of the divine feminine, divine masculine upon the parents begins in the infancy stage of the unconscious, right? And the infant at this stage is still used to feeling unconditional love at the soul level, right? Because it still has a little bit of thread of this connection. So it's not really used to how we see things in the material world, really. It's still used to like, yeah, you know, everything is good. Everything's peaceful. Everything's joyful. I have this unconditional love and I feel it very strongly still, right? But most parents almost always fall short of that pure unconditional love, right? Because obviously they're on their own soul and healing journey as well. So of course they're not perfect and perfected and are still unable to reflect that love in its purest form. So birth is always that first stage of a soul's unique and individual experience. The second stage is individuation. This is while the birth, this is the part of where the birth is at beginning, but this is the part of the soul's journey where the child doesn't really become conscious anymore. Well, it becomes conscious of the separation, right? So it's the individuation. It is a part where you start to own your individual identity a little bit, right? And this happens around the age of 2. We talked about that a little bit before, and we enter that phase, right? Everybody's kind of familiar with that phase. What do they call it? The terrible twos, right? And as part of this, the parent attempts to guide the child, setting all these new limitations and boundaries. Don't do this, don't do that. And the child defiantly is like, no, and crying and all this kind of stuff, because it's starting to feel the limitations of the material world for the first time, right? And this is the first sign in the beginning and the creation of that false ego, because it doesn't like the limitation. And now it's like, what do I do? Okay. So although the separation initially begins at the birth stage, in the unconscious mind, it is at that stage of individuation, that the child becomes conscious of the things that are separate from it, and this free will starts to take part, right? Because before that, it was still operating off of this connection, and now we want to be able to, we recognizing this separation, and we start to try and figure out what's really going on in the world. And this is where we start to begin this healing journey, trying to align our consciousness back to, divine will, right? It's that false ego starting to get developed here. And honestly, it's from this point on, we're going to be working to try and connect with our higher true self. And that's why it's hard for us most to remember anything past the age of 2, right? Because at that point, we're still kind of in that unity consciousness flow. It's not until 2 years old, give or take a few months, that we start to be separate enough where we start to express our own will and start expanding and contracting. Like I said, what is, reaching out, expanding towards love, and contracting, in pain, in fear, because, we're afraid of something. What if this happens? Or what if that happens, right? This is when this all starts to take place. The third stage is called the dream in the wounded child. This is the part of the soul's journey when dreams and visions emerge from the unconscious mind, and super strong imagination, right, starts to be birthed in the child, right? Imagination has no boundaries, no limitations, no constrictions of what's possible. We all remember this time probably, and if you have children, you remember this period of time where they're just, free and imagining and playing, and what about this? And it's a really beautiful period of time for them, because they're starting to open up to the wonders and the possibilities of the world. And this is reaching them through the initial programs that are applied at the unconscious level, right? That they're tapping into and want to be able to express in the world. So it's a really, truly beautiful period of time, right? All those fantasies of flying without wings, magical wizards, magic wands, all that playtime stuff that we used to do. It's really a beautiful time of miraculous adventures, and it's born all through a child's imagination. A child at this point knows, right? The imagination really has no bounds and begins to creep in, like playing and doing all kinds of different things, exploring what do I want to be when I grow up, right? That sort of thing. Again, beautiful, beautiful time. But as the child's illusions are confronted by limitations, right, we start to impose on him or her, and this is by the parents, teachers, and society as a whole, right? You start to say, well, you can't really do this. You can't really do that. This isn't really real. I can remember very distinctively when that was happening for me. And when my level of imagination was starting to, become smaller and smaller, because I kept being told, well, you can't really do that. You can't really do this as well. This isn't really how it works, right? So this, unfortunately, just as quickly as the child begins to open up to this stream of consciousness, or the stream of information from the unconscious mind, trying to bring in these ideas of imagination, it's quickly snuffed out, unfortunately, not knowingly, by parents, teachers, and just society as a whole. And sometimes it occurs at a stage that opens up a deep, deep wounding of the soul's initial separation from divine source. It's from here that every wound is played out through the drama of physical life. This is where that initial inner child wounding starts to happen, right? Whether it's on a physical level, emotional level, or mentally abused, right? Whatever it is that was inflicted on a child, any one of these levels opens up a deep wound as a reminder of this separation from the higher self and the divine source. Because remember, it wasn't too long ago that they still remembered what this felt like. And the contrast is so different. It's quite traumatic for a child, right? And for parents, they may not even realize it. But something that happened to them is imprinted so strongly, it creates the theme that will be played out over and over again throughout their life with greater and greater intensity, right? And it's not till later on in life we realize, like, man, where is this all coming from? And then this is where it begins, and it's a part of a theme of the soul's journey, right? And physical, whether it's physical or sexual abuse, is, it's a kind of loss of innocence, which is cut short, from that sense of wonder and amazement that they just had as a childhood, right? So going from playing and flying and imagining to all of that, all of a sudden this innocence that connected them intuitively to the unconscious part of our mind starts to get broken, right? And this is unfortunately when it happens. And this kind of wound can be created by something super harsh. Like I said, everything from traumatic is some type of, violent act or abuse or sexual abuse, something very harsh, or it can be something as simple as a scraped knee. Whatever the wound is, the experience for a child is very intense. Right. So you as a parent might not think anything of it. They scrape their knee and you're just like, oh, you'll be fine. Right. And that in that moment, they were really needing that unconditional love and you didn't realize it. And all of a sudden, boom, it created a wound that's there. They're not even aware of that now says, oh, when I need love, I don't really get it. Right. And now it's creating the false ego and it starts creating all kinds of different plots and plans on how can I get love. Right. So it's an incredibly important period of time for a child. Right. And they integrate this experience and it gets shoved deeper and deeper into the subconscious, only to arise again as a repeated pattern over and over again throughout the adolescent life and throughout the adult life. Right. We're all familiar with this. Now, the fourth stage is something called the crash and burn syndrome. It's during the teen years that this false ego attains its full capacity of its identity, right? All about me, right? This is the stage in the soul's journey when the false ego is most self-conscious and perhaps the most self-centered as it possibly can be, right? It's reaching the maximum stage here at this point. And whether the personality is introverted or extroverted, the intensity of the mental, emotional, and physical identity of the false ego for a teenager can feel like life or death experience, while to an adult, it may seem like nothing at all. We probably all remember that during those teenage years and how important friends are and this, and we get older and we look back and it's like, oh, it doesn't seem like a big deal. But back then, it felt like it was life or death. And it doesn't really matter when we reflect back. It's so intense. The intensity of it creates the energetic scarring that creates the false egoic behavior that then gets played out over and over again throughout your life, right? The intensity is so strong that because of all the stimulation, and even today, it's probably even stronger, right? Think about it like, years ago, it was already pretty intense. Doesn't matter during your school years and that sort of thing. But now with the addition of social media and all of the stimulation that we have online, it can be even more intense and more cruel, right? This is one of the reasons why you're seeing such an increase in mental health issues, right? It's just because the experience is becoming more and more intense. And it's during this stage for a teenager, it feels like all eyes are constantly focused only on them, right? And all their subconscious flaws, or oppositely, maybe they think they're great and they're really arrogant and have a lot of pride, right? And they're the most popular kid and they're the center of the world. But the point is they feel like it's all about them. And that means whether it is something that is negative that's happening to them, or they create some false ego based on thinking they're the best thing ever, it's still feeding the false ego, and it's setting the stage for repeated behaviors, beliefs, and thought patterns throughout the rest of their life during this time. So another important, incredible period of time for the soul's journey. And it's also during this time that every teenager during the stage of the soul's journey also has those moments of feeling passionately immortal, right? Physical death is something you rarely even think about at this point, right? Of course, there's tragedies that happen, but for most teenagers, they don't really believe that anything tragic can ever happen to them. And this is a trick of the process of the amplified teenage false ego, right? And why so many young people live daringly, and you only live once, right? YOLO, drive fast, recklessly, and unfortunately ends very tragically sometimes. There's a reason why, car insurance is cheaper, when you get older as opposed when you're younger, because you've got this program running that it's like, I can do anything. And it serves a purpose too, right? But it's at this point, you're just feeling like you can, take over the world kind of thing, right? But at this time, it's also where these extreme passions start to take place, right? And it's, again, that energy behind it. The true purpose of it is for actually fueling the aspirations of the higher conscious mind. So if this journey was happening in a balanced way, let's say, right, you would be going through all those stages that I mentioned. You would come through and receive all of that imagination. You'd be able to express that imagination. You go into your adolescent years, you'd be fueled with all this passionate energy so that you could be able to express that and make it actually happen, right? But that usually doesn't take place, unfortunately. But that original programming at the unconscious level for the child, this is what's trying to happen. It's wanting to express itself through imagination, through play, but it is the false ego, while at the same time is distorting that and creating this false expression at the same exact time. So this stage unfortunately ends with the crash and burn syndrome, right? So that's why we call this. You're going through all of this, feel like you're on top of the world, whatever it might be, or even if you had issues, this is where during that passionate striving of childhood, right, as dreams of the teenager, you encounter that first intense experience of disappointment, right? This can be something like not getting asked to prom, somebody hurting your feelings, maybe a breakup, not making a team, failing a test, anything that challenges their self-worth, all about them. Remember what their overinflated false ego might think of, their peers, how they think of them, how somebody might be teasing them, or make fun of them. We all know how cruel some teenagers can be during this time. And we can all recall some form of disappointment that happened during this period. It doesn't matter how big or how small that disappointment may appear to everyone else on the outside. The soul and the false ego feels it as a childhood, during the childhood, and it's really opening up that wound continuously. It's like, here we go again. I'm not connected with source, right? So it's reopening it again and again because of the intensity of the energy during our teenage years. It is imprinting us again. A pattern of old and new dreams continue to emerge throughout our lives, right? And they also will be followed up by additional appointments and disappointments, and it's happening over and over again, right? So this pattern repeats, and ultimately it leads to what is been termed that dark night of the soul, right? And a kind of, if anybody's gone through that, it kind of feels like it's a period of time of hopelessness. Like you just, like more than depression, you just feel like, what am I going to do? You've lost all hope. You can't really see the future and don't understand what to do next. So you have this pattern of this wound repeating until the intensity builds up so much that you eventually go through this dark night of the soul. And that's what's happening. It's that point that the higher self is really, really calling out for us to like, hey, okay, the intensity this is happening over and over again. This is really getting out of hand, right? It's really time for you to reflect and realign yourselves with the greater purpose of the higher self. So that's the purpose of the dark night of the soul. It's really trying to, like, that warning signal of like, hey, things are getting really, really tough here. Let's kind of, regroup and recalibrate. Okay, so the fifth stage is called the resurrection of the dream, which is symbolically represented by the phoenix rising out of its own ashes. From here, we must find the courage to overcome the rude awakening of that crash and burn, right? So we just went through all that disappointment, right? And now it's time to awaken and resurrect our own childhood imagination and hopefully find the courage to be able to dream once again. Okay. So dark night of the soul, hopefully we pull ourselves out of that and we go through this rebirth. This is the next stage. But this time, we should hopefully have enough experience with this new level of understanding, maturity, and awareness that we've gained through our soul's journey thus far, where we will be able to apply this new knowledge and wisdom, right? Whereas before, you might have had a dream you wanted to manifest, but you just let your false ego power it, right? It was fueled by this false ego that was doing it for the wrong reasons. Whereas now, whatever it is you're trying to accomplish should be fueled by your higher self and the connection with divine source first. So the sixth stage is where most of us get hung up, unfortunately. This is the challenge of the dark and light shadow and duality that must be integrated into wholeness, right? As I mentioned before, all of our experiences are recorded on the subconscious level of the mind during our lifetime. And as all these ideas or beliefs, get formed and get stored in the unconscious mind as part of our programming, these traumas, start to build up. And we might, in any of those traumas that get built up, we start to experience those, right? And we are unable to process or integrate them. And so they just keep getting stuffed back into our unconscious mind. And that contributes to the collective unconscious mind. So again, it's this feedback loop. It's like, we're going through this pattern, we get triggered, something comes up, we're not able to process it, boom, shove it back into the unconscious mind. It's recorded in the subconscious, we recontribute it back to the collective, and the collective, feeds it back to us through everything else that we see. And it's just this loop that we're constantly getting stuck in, right? And because we're unable to handle the intensity of the emotions, we become easily triggered anytime the emotions begin to arise again. And if we don't have the tools to process and integrate that emotion, it just continues to get stuffed back into the unconscious, right? And unfortunately, for most of us, this is where it is. And again, there's levels of this, right? So some emotions maybe are easier than others, and we're able to process those, and other ones are too intense. And those are the ones that actually get stuffed back into our unconscious, and we keep repeating over and over again. And again, this, don't feel bad about this. This is part of the process, honestly. And that's why it's a step-by-step process that we're integrating slowly over a period of time. And you have to be gentle with yourself a little bit too, right, as you're going through this process. So if we don't have the tools to process and integrate the emotion, it continues, like I said, to get stuff back into the unconscious, and the false ego begins to orchestrate an agenda of blaming and playing the victim, right? We start to engage in all kinds of manipulation, and this control stems from that insecurity as a survival mechanism. So we want to be aware of this, even though we know we want to be gentle with ourselves. And as we're going through this step-by-step process of healing, we want to be aware of this and try our best not to blame others and play the victim role, right? Projecting blame into the external world from the false ego is nothing but taking the spiritual responsibility for the root cause, right? And just putting it somewhere else, right? It's about taking on a new level of awareness become spiritually mature, right? And spiritual maturity requires us to be more responsible for creating our own reality. That's really what it is. Doesn't mean that we have to necessarily have healed it yet, but we're aware of what we're doing and we're aware we need to continue working on it. And that's okay, right? All of the false ego games of manipulation, control, and blame make up the dark shadow. And this is what we want to be aware of. By the time we're adults, we have this trunk full of emotional baggage because we've been carrying around with us this entire time. And the false ego is doing everything possible to try and hide this wounding. Now, on top of that, all of those additional belief systems that are stored in the unconscious and connected to, like I said before, right, our race, nationality, our profession, our gender, our economic class, et cetera, all that is playing a part too, right? So you can begin to understand why so many of us get stuck here. It's, honestly, it's quite the task, right? You've got all these different layers happening at once. That's why spiritual psychology is, something you could spend a huge amount of time discussing and talking about and learning and working through, because there's so many different layers. And at least by learning the mechanics and the metaphysics and behind all of this, you can be better equipped, right? To be aware, to be mindful, and witness, compassionately witness, I should say, and what's actually going on with yourself, and also express the empathy for what's happening to other people, right? So that's why we're going through all of this today. But there's also something called the light shadow. And this part doesn't get discussed nearly as much. We all know about the dark shadow, but the light shadow, most people don't talk about it too much. And what the light shadow is, these are all the unclaimed qualities that are inherent gifts that stream down from your higher self. So just like the dark shadow are qualities of and characteristics and behaviors that we are kind of blocking and don't want to acknowledge and express. The light shadow is the same thing, but these are good divine qualities that are part of who you actually are, that are waiting to be expressed and for you to be able to take ownership of, but it requires you to first forgive yourself, heal, and release some of this trauma. Right? So this is something that you also want to be aware of, and start taking ownership of some of these things and start expressing it, because it's not a linear thing. As you start to express some of these light shadow qualities, the more light you bring in, it'll start healing some of the dark shadow qualities, right? So it's holographic. It's still, they work with each other. This is where your power comes from, okay? And you'll be able to fulfill more of your divine purpose as you start to be able to claim some of this. And this is why the entire SOLANCHA system is about creating harmony and balance within our mental, emotional, and physical bodies to be able to help heal and to take ownership of some of these qualities, right? And this is where the healing and integration must take place, which in turn opens up that higher self, right? So that's what we're working on. And just because the unconscious, dark and light shadow exists at the personal level and the collective level as well, right? This also has a very big impact on us. So it isn't just really ourselves. It is always this ascension process happening on a personal level and a collective level. So you have a dark and light shadow on the personal level and a dark and light shadow on the collective level. So just as you're going through, your dramas and all of that, trying to evolve and express these different qualities throughout your life, right, in order to be able to awaken more fully, the same thing is happening and being played out on a global scale. So everything you see on TV, whether it's political scandals and wars. This is the same exact thing happening on a macro level that's happening to you on an internal micro level. It is a game of dark and light that is being played out as dramas in the lives and the collective experiences of everyone on the planet, collectively and personally, right? And when you understand that, it will help you be able to witness these things in a more compassionate way without getting emotionally triggered. And that is the key to staying balanced, which is going to be incredibly important as we're going through this transition period, right? 2024, we've talked about that. In 2025, there's going to be new levels of changes in intensities on all the various different levels of life, that if you remember this lesson here and why that's happening, it's going to help you to be able to stay much more calm as we're moving through all these different things moving forward. Okay? Whenever an individual person projects blame onto any other person, right, or any external cause, this is the projection of the dark shadow. Have to remember that. The false ego will always reflect an inner thought process and an emotional pattern of self-righteousness and justification of its position, right? But an extrovert will go as far as to pronounce these self-righteous ideas to anyone in an audience, anybody who's willing to listen. And this will create entire groups of communities that join in the blaming. This people, that people, this is what they're doing. How can you, can you believe what this is happening, right? And when you participate in that expression, that projection of the dark shadow, you are also participating in feeding that back into the dark shadow of the collective unconscious. Right? So you need to be aware of what's actually taking place and do your best to not participate in any of those behaviors, because not only is it harming you, you're also harming the greater collective as well. Okay. The same thing is happening with nations, with groups of people acting out, of this dark shadow collectively. Happens on a national level. Large groups of people may display self-righteousness and justify their position as a nation without owning anything that their own government or nation has put into effect into the larger global community. Blaming governments or authority figures for, represents giving spiritual power over to, the spiritual power to act responsibly in exchange for the false ego doing all the blaming, right? So when you align yourself with what is often called, you hear like, even in the spiritual community, white hats and the dark hats, you end up really aligning yourself, right? And supporting those shadows in your own unconscious, right? So you're developing that in your own, you're basically feeding your own ego and feeding that dark shadow in your own unconscious, and you're contributing to the ongoing shadow projection at the collective level, okay? So it's really important to be able to compassionately witness these things and understand what's happening from a much broader and higher perspective from the higher self, and not get caught up in all of the games and the dramas, which is just going to continue the perpetual or the perpetuation of these dark and light shadow games that we're seeing right now. Okay. Owning the dark shadow means to consciously take responsibility for the hurtful impact of the ego upon yourself, upon others, and upon the greater world. The light work of integration is owning the dark shadow and the false ego at the personal level. And then once you've done it at the personal level, then you can aid shifting the greater collective, the dark shadow into light. Okay. But it requires honest self-reflection and introspection work. It's required for you to forgive yourself, right? Of all the actions of the false ego, hurt and blame for contributing to the collective dark shadow. And this is some of the most important spiritual work you can do. Then you can claim your gifts from the light shadow and bring forth the light into the world. Okay, so this is what you should be spending your time on, working on yourself, focusing on the dark aspects of your own self and how you might have been contributing to the collective dark shadow and how you can heal that. The more people, especially in the spiritual community, the more people just focusing on doing the healing work, doing the spiritual work and all of that, as opposed to pointing the blame, will do far more than just pointing the blame and all those kind of different things, right? Now, doesn't mean that you are condoning any of this bad behavior. It is just finding the best way to be able to spend your time so that you can positively impact and bring more light into the dark in this world. Okay, so the seventh and final stage of the soul's journey is death as a transition, as you can imagine. Remember, the soul is mortal, so it does typically have a death. And remember, it's only the false ego that fears death because of its attachments to the 3D material world. And death doesn't just mean physical death, but it can also be the death of an experience at any of the levels of consciousness. We already discussed how we experience the death of dreams during the adolescent teenage years as part of the crash and burn stage, right? Spiritual psychology requires the broader understanding of dying of old patterns in order to make the way for the spiritual, for new spiritual truths or birthing new spiritual ideas of and awakening to the higher self. And this is why the SOLANCHA system, we start with the energy of So, right? Which is the feminine energy. The feminine energy is really about deconstructing, right? And the side that is going to be the healing side of the energy so that we can be able to do that, which will allow us to be able to awaken to our higher self. Right? The So energy is magnetic, but it's also destructive in the sense that it's used to deconstruct old beliefs, old ideas, old thoughts and behavior patterns that no longer serve us, right? So you see, death is required sometimes in order to transcend or transform a state of consciousness that no longer is serving us, so we can start again. And that brings us back to the current transition period we're in right now and why you can expect to see the death of a lot of old systems and ways of thinking so that a new birth of new ideas and new ways of living can come into existence, okay? Now, I want to emphasize one thing here that has to do with suicide as an escape mechanism of trauma of one's life. I've heard some individuals, spiritual teachers even, discuss it as completely acceptable. And I want to caution people that this is in no way something that you can use to provide you with some type of escape hatch to some better situation, okay? In fact, if you were unable to process and integrate some trauma, something really intense that happened to you to the point that you've chosen to cease your life, that level of suffering actually will get carried into the astral plane, magnetically align you with the lower subplanes of the astral, okay, which have been described as the hellish realms and were depicted in Dante's poem, The Inferno. So it's always better to seek out and help and try to get as much help as you can and try to integrate these emotions as best as you can, because you will, it's not only going to not help you, you could end up experiencing far more pain and suffering than you actually realize, okay? Another example of the false ego and the fear of death is the aging process. And I'm not referring to the desire for health and longevity, right? In short, the longer we are able to live in a state of wellness, the more time we have to heal and integrate and align with our higher self. So living longer, living healthy is a great thing. We should be trying to live as long as possible, because the more time we have, the more time we have to be able to heal and integrate and align with our higher self. So for many spiritual people, by the time you're just starting to figure things out, right, and you're going through this process, all these 7 stages, and start to figure out how things actually work, and you begin participating in your own healing journey, the body starts to already fail, and the death of the physical body comes as part of the transition, right? And so it's really a tricky kind of thing. And this is followed up by reincarnation and starting that whole process again. And you might feel like, man, I didn't even get a chance to really, half my life, I didn't even understand what was happening. How am I supposed to really progress, right? And it's true to some degree, right? Because, and that's why it's a long process. So living longer in a healthy body is definitely advantageous and beneficial to the ascension and your spiritual awakening process. But what I'm referring to in regard to the aging process has to do more with the false ego's search for external approval and validation, providing some false sense of self-esteem in place of the internal self-divine love, right? Which only can come from within. Underlining this is always that false ego longing for immortality, right? But true immortality can never be achieved through the false ego, because its very nature is temporal and mortal. True immortality must be achieved through the immortal spirit, aligning with the immortal spirit. In actuality, the more one fears death, they tend to attract it more quickly, because the belief is held more strongly in the unconscious mind. It gets played out, and then they attract situations that can cause death for them. So I won't go too much into detail here now, but there are spiritual masters out there who have obtained certain levels of immortality, where they are able to keep their body alive or generate a new body based on metaphysical laws for extreme lengths, amounts of time. But again, it's not because for some selfish reason, because they just want to, live, a life of luxury for as long as they possibly can. It's no, there's a purpose behind it. Oh, they're bodhisattvas who are staying behind and helping humanity from behind the scenes be able to evolve and assist in the ascension process. There's usually some type of higher spiritual reason for them to be able to do that, not just be able to look good for eternity and, live their best life, right? Or eternal life or something along those lines, right? So something to be able to keep in mind and to be aware of. So even though all of these 7 stages of the soul are experienced in the physical world in a linear fashion, they also exist on a core level, just as a spiritual experience, right? This means that all of these experiences can happen in stages earlier on, right? So, for example, as the soul awakens through the stages, the conscious mind learns to become more spiritually aware, and higher consciousness can participate in its own, ascension process and becoming this awakened conscious creator. You can, the birth stage, the individuation, the dream, and you can go through all these stages much more quickly than just, from birth to death, right? And that's why I mentioned it could be the death of an actual idea or something like that. All these things are just themes that are being played out, but then the greater theme is the actual lifespan as well, which does happen through the physical birth and the physical death as well, right? So again, just as a recap, starts with birth, then it goes to individuation. Then there's that dream of the wounded child, followed up by disappointment and the crash and burn syndrome, right? The resurrection of the dream, finding the courage to be able to start again, usually followed up again by the patterns that we weren't able to heal and having to work through the dark and light shadow. And then finally death comes as a transition when, it's just, not enough time basically. And now the body gets, spirit basically takes the body back and goes through the whole process again.